Welcome to the very first episode of Permission to Be Pretty podcast. I am your very own Dr. Unique Simpson, and I am excited for what we will cover in these enlightening, empowering, and encouraging discussions. Now, why this podcast? How did it come to be? I was having a conversation, actually a discussion with some very important women in my life, and we were discussing the importance of being comfortable in our own skin, and the discussion itself evolved, and a comment was made that one of the young women had to learn and is still learning how to be okay with who she is and what she likes, how she likes to keep herself and present herself, which I think many of us can attest to, right? So I began thinking and going back to the very first subject was being comfortable in our own skin. And one would think in terms of this that we only have to overcome our flaws. We only have to overcome and develop a positive relationship with our flaws. But then I don't know that we talk much about overcoming and being okay with our strengths. What one or some would not consider to be a flaw, unless, of course, they are intimidated by our strengths. So I sat, and out of this discussion and my subsequent pondering and meditating, I decided that we need to talk. My desire is to talk to a broader audience and to again enlighten, encourage, and empower many. Now, I would also like to be enlightened and encouraged and further empowered myself. So that is how this podcast was born, and now here we are. I do want to say this, though, that when we think of giving ourselves permission to be pretty, we think only of women. And yeah, it's not necessarily common or normalized, especially in today's society, to want or to call a man pretty. But when you break down the acronym, I want to be very clear that permission to be powerful, real, emotional, transparent, teachable, and unique are not reserved for women only. Men ought to also give themselves permission to be powerful, to be real, to be emotional, to be transparent, to be teachable, and yes, unique. So I want to give that disclaimer. I'm not sure how many men will be comfortable when asked, "What are you listening to?" stating, "I am listening to this Permission to Be Pretty podcast." But hey, to each his own. I do want men to know that this is for them as well. And perhaps we can have some guests who are of the male persuasion on at some point, and they can share their thoughts on the topic. Now, what is my promise to you with this podcast? I promise to be vulnerable. In order for this podcast to do what I believe it can, what I believe God wants to do with it and through it, through our discussions, I believe that vulnerability is a requirement. Now, part of, or I guess, in my seeking and coming up with the acronym and what each letter stands for, my process of choosing the word transparent is because I have personally had to overcome. I want to make sure that sounded grammatically correct. Yes, I am transparent to a fault. And in my transparency, well, let me first say that the reason I am is because I, one, feel deeply. I feel on a very deep level. And I have often been made to feel like my transparency, vulnerability, and feeling so deep is a weakness. And sometimes, even when others haven't made me feel like that, I have decided within myself that I showed or that I displayed weakness. And so I've had to give myself permission to be that. I've had to become okay with showing my heart, not guarding it in the way that one thinks that I should, and dealing with the consequences of it. There are moments in my life as I was being reared, molded, shaped, right? And dealing with so much that I think I wished someone was more vulnerable and more transparent. Because many times in my life, I felt as though I was completely alone. And I felt as though there was something wrong with me because I was not stronger. Yeah. And perhaps if I didn't think something was wrong with me, I wouldn't have felt the need to hide as much as I have in my life. So the people who were trying to guide me, give me advice, mentor me, if you will, I think I was always kind of told to toughen up, stop being a victim, stop letting everything devastate me. You know, it was kind of recite these scriptures, pray, give it to God, and no one ever gave me permission to feel being called in the area of the fivefold that I'm called to, and just being called to people in general. I feel, and it's a requirement. I feel deeply. I feel people. I feel God. And it's why or how I believe God trusts me and how I am effective. So I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to cry. Sometimes you all will hear me or feel me cry, and sometimes you may not know. But this is me giving myself permission to be vulnerable and praying that my vulnerability will ignite you all to be vulnerable, to share, to think, to ponder, to meditate. And not necessarily, you don't have to share with me, you don't have to share with, everyone, but at least be honest with yourself about your feelings, about how you have arrived to some or many of the conclusions that you have regarding self and others. So I pray that everything I just said makes sense, but I believe in essence that in order for this to be effective, it is going to require vulnerability, not just from me, but again from those who I will be fortunate enough to engage in discussions with on this podcast. So if you're still with me, I want to break down this acronym PRETTY. Permission to be pretty. And yes, I'm going to talk about myself quite a bit on today's episode because I want to spark thought and just kind of give you examples of what I mean. So I say, let's talk giving ourselves permission to be powerful. Let's start there. Permission to be powerful. So we have power. We have power. I have power. You have power. And the intent is that we be powerful. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. There's actually so much that I want to say about this, but I want future discussions even to, I want to leave room, I guess. What I will say is this. I made a post not too long ago, I think right after I announced this podcast. And I said that in order to give ourselves permission, we must first know that we are. I want to say this. The struggle becomes when your power intimidates others, when your pretty intimidates others, when you're being powerful, real, emotional, transparent, teachable, unique, but power is intimidating. Walking in your power, talking in your power, standing 10 toes down in your power can be so intimidating that a few things happen. One, I've had people try to essentially tell me to hush. I sing, and I don't need a microphone. And I remember singing and often being told to tone it down, right? Um, in the area that I operate in now, you hear it, don't take all that. Um, because I am not soft spoken and essentially what many would consider to be ladylike. I am forceful and passionate and deep, and I am not, I guess, soft enough, but I am me, and I am who God created me to be. And I have a boldness about me that even I have had to get used to. I walk in a room and I don't hide, I don't cower. Now, as a side note, what people see and are intimidated by, they have no clue what it takes, because people haven't seen me cry. They haven't seen me cry myself to sleep. They haven't seen me beg God to get someone else to do it. They haven't seen or haven't even had a glimpse of the cost, the toll that it takes, the emotional toll. Man, it costs everything. But being powerful is a gift. And yes, it comes with a lot. Even when people see and envy the power, but again, having no idea what it takes to be bold enough to not minimize how powerful we are. So when I say give yourself permission to be powerful, I mean be powerful and all that comes with it. The loss and the gains. The impact. The impact. Our power is that we may be effective, that the will and the way of the one who has endowed us with so much power would be realized in the earth. Permission to be powerful. Permission then to be real. Real, authentic, authentically you. Give yourself permission. Along those same lines, in my giving myself permission to be powerful. And I want to say this really quickly. You don't give yourself permission one time. Permission is a constant and consistent act. It is the ultimate act of self-care. Permission that no matter what room I walk in, I will not dumb down in any way and in any area. I constantly and consistently give myself permission to be. Period. Hear me. Permission to be. Period. And then everything else follows. I should have led with that, but hopefully, if you're still here and still listening, you have received those words. So, permission to be powerful, and now permission to be real. In other words, permission to be me, permission to be authentic, to walk in the authenticity of who I am. Now, again, there's so much that can be said about this, but permission to be authentic. Man, just who you are is who you are. And even if you have growing to do, I believe that God can do everything with authenticity. A true person, one who loves you, one who means you only good and not harm, one who is willing to embrace you, who themselves are authentic and have no agenda, will accept the real you. They will accept the real you. What happens when we show up and we lack authenticity, when we do not give ourselves permission to be real, we then spend a lifetime pretending. Because at what point do you know enough to turn it off? We read this book in our book club talking about the subconscious mind. I won't cite the specific book because I want to credit the author and I'm not remembering his name currently. But something he said, and I do want to be clear, these are not my words, but something he said is that the subconscious mind cannot take a joke. The subconscious mind believes whatever we tell it to believe. So that leads me to believe that if I tell my subconscious mind that we must show up inauthentic, that we must hide the real us, my subconscious mind not only believes it, but will not on its own know when it's time for the jig to be up. Be real. Be real. Too often, when we are not accepted for our realness, for the authenticity of who we are, we walk away thinking there is something wrong with us. It cannot possibly be that perhaps the person or people we encountered are simply not worthy of us, or, that we are perfect the way that we are. Our mind automatically goes to what is wrong with me. Think about relationships, failed relationships, or when we're not accepted, when we're rejection. For whatever reason, out of our losses, insecurity is birthed. Not that there's something wrong with them and not me. Or even if, I want to be clear, it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with them either. Who we are is not intended for everyone. My voice is not a voice for everyone. My style of coaching, mentoring, leading, believing is not for everyone. I'm a little rough around the edges and I've grown to like it. Who I am, the real me, the authenticity of me, I have a propensity to take people to task. And not everyone can handle that. And hear me, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with them, and it doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. It's just who we are. But I will always be real and be authentic. First of all, I've come too far and I've grown to be too comfortable with who I am to turn back now. So, permission to be powerful and permission to be real. Now, let's get into giving ourselves permission to be emotional. Again, I was always kind of taught to hide emotion. Now, I know that men have been taught, toughen up, stop crying. But I don't think we talk enough about women being pretty much given the same advice, or we might be expected to cry. Oh, my. I was getting ready to take this somewhere that it's not necessarily intended to go. As women, we are expected to cry, but not expected to feel. We are expected to cry, but we are not expected to feel. And then men are not expected to cry, but are expected to feel. Man, that's a word. Sit with that for a moment. Men are not expected to cry, but they are expected to feel. And women, yeah, they're going to cry, as they say. They expect us to cry, but they don't want us to feel. When we feel, we are chastised for feeling. We are gaslighted for feeling. We are minimized and belittled for feeling. Men are chastised for crying, belittled, minimized, emasculated for crying, but then receive the same for not having the ability to feel their spouses, their partners and companions, their children. They've been taught to disconnect and then crucified for their innate ability to do just that. Man, I'm going to have to leave that there because that'll be an awesome discussion. So all of us, must give ourselves permission to be emotional. Yeah, I don't know that I have time today to dig into that, but essentially what I'm saying is permission to feel. Permission to feel. Every one of us, men and women, we feel. We absolutely feel, whether we give ourselves permission or not. We feel, but we must give ourselves permission to feel deeply, to feel in a moment, for a moment, in order to heal from a thing, in order to trust God to be healed, in order to be comforted, in order to receive comfort, to receive love and support. There has to be something presented. I can't need healing yet hide what I need to be healed from. I can't receive comfort if I am hiding what is in me that needs to be comforted. And so, permission to be emotional. Essentially, what I mean is permission to feel. Permission to feel. And permission to feel deep. Permission to feel on a deep level, on a deeper level than many of us allow. Sometimes, well, I'll be talking for another hour if I dig a little too deep into that, but that's a discussion that I am excited to expound upon and excited to discuss further. Again, with many of you listening, women and men alike. I'm excited for that discussion. Permission to be transparent. Yeah, I touched on this in the beginning of the episode. Permission to be transparent. I come from a world, especially in the church, especially, I don't know, maybe it's cultural, but we have to hide. We've been taught to hide. We've been taught, yeah. We've been taught to hide what we're going through, taught to, hide. I think, many of us in our culture, in the African American culture, the Black household, right? We grew up learning the term family business. What goes on in this house stays in this house. So we have been taught to hide. And I get it. Our business is not everyone's business. But then again, how does a child differentiate between what somebody needs to know and what is just simply not everyone's business? I think, there are stories for days, experiences for days, for years of people growing up in households where abuse was happening and different things were going on, and there was a fear of telling. So that is something that has been embedded in us since the beginning. Unfortunately, I have shared a story growing up. And I think it's pertinent for this. So I was, if you don't know me, and many of you listening do, I was an orphan. My mother physically abused us. She also instilled in us the term family business. And so I remember a time where I was at the babysitter with my brother, and I was sharing some things. And even as I think back on it in that moment, I knew I was talking a little too much, but I just felt like it, I guess. And so I was sharing some things. My brother was listening. He wouldn't dare speak. And when our mother picked us up, the first thing he said when he got in the car was, "Mama, Neek was telling the family business." And I think she reached back, hit me, and what she said, I'll never forget, was, "Because of this, don't speak to me for 30 days. Do not speak to me." And that was my punishment. I couldn't talk to her, my mother. And at this time, I was a little girl. I was still living in California. So I had to be about 5 or 6 years old because we moved to the East Coast when I was 7. And I couldn't speak to her. And she was serious about it. So I'll never forget, there was a day, probably a week or two later, where I was excited about something that had happened. And when she picked us up, I jumped in the car and I would just begin rambling. "Hey, Mama, guess what? And I'm just talking and talking. And she stopped me and said, did you forget that I'm not speaking to you? And it crushed me. And so that was the first memory that I have where I was taught to not share and to not share anything. So much so that even after my brother and I ran away and we were now in foster care, and part of the process is that you go through counseling. And I never talked. I never said a word. Although we never went back home, I think her not speaking to me crushed me. And so even if she got word that although we were no longer living with her, I was now talking, I don't know, I guess no one was ever going to be able to tell her that I was telling the family business. So anyway, that experience taught me to hide. And so there were several other instances, but that's what taught me. That's what taught me that being transparent was a curse. I then, went on with life, grew up, and now I'm in ministry, and I live in a world, in a society where status is everything, right? And where you're only taken seriously if you have this or you're successful at this. And so, again, this fear of transparency began following me because I don't have a big platform. I'm not a Nepo baby, and, I don't know. So, to establish myself, I guess something else that I've been taught, right? It's like to establish yourself, you have to have a perfect or near perfect life. You have to be successful in this area. And in order to be taken seriously, you hide, you cover, you don't dare share your business. I often think back to times in my life early when I was going through some things and people would come and again try to encourage me. And I just remember feeling like, how can you encourage me when your life is perfect? Even if you have a clue about what I'm going through, there's nothing that you can say to encourage me because your life is perfect. Mine is in shambles. And how am I supposed to receive from you? Looking back, I just wish someone would have said, my life is not perfect either. I feel you. I understand. And so I have decided or given myself permission to be transparent so that even though people see power and they see real and they see emotion, they know that they're not alone. I'm not saying, you just go telling your business to everybody. But what about that person that needs to know they're not alone? Had I known that I was not alone, my process probably would have been, or most likely would have been, just a little smoother. just a little easier. I have felt more alone than I have ever felt not alone. And so I just wish that there was someone, or I want to say more people, but I just don't know anyone really who was ever completely transparent with me. So it's something that I've had to learn on my own, and to learn with God that transparency is a gift, because people see you and you have this title, and you operate in a certain way or in a certain atmosphere, and they think too that there's something wrong with them. And so transparency is a gift. I'll leave you with that. Transparency is a gift. And so we must give ourselves permission to be transparent. One, it's freeing. Two, it's it's freeing not just for you, but for someone else. And so when we think about being effective and making an impact in the world, transparency, I want to say transparency with wisdom, I guess. Yeah. To try to soften it for someone who will counter and say, I don't know. But transparency, it's a gift. Permission to be teachable. I don't care who you are, how much you think you have arrived. All of us are learning every day. We have the opportunity, the space, the capacity to learn if we will allow ourselves. I am Apostle Dr. Unique Simpson. I have 4 degrees, right? I'm committed to be a lifelong learner, and a doctor is, I guess, the highest, right, degree, the highest degree that you can earn. But I would do myself a disservice if I somehow decide within myself that there's nothing left for me to learn. One, I'm so addicted to learning and so addicted to education that I'm still trying to figure out how I can pursue another degree. But then just in general, I don't know everything. And not just in the field of education and going to college, but just in life. You can learn so much from so many people. I learn from my children. You can learn from nature. There's so much to learn from God, so much to learn from this world, so much to learn. You've heard me say, that I was an orphan. And so I grew up in different homes. And because I didn't have someone just sitting me down and teaching me, I have learned a whole lot by people watching, women watching. I've watched women, and years ago decided on the kind of woman that I wanted to be. I've had a keen eye for class and dignity, integrity. And so I would just watch people and learn from them. And I still do today. I love finding out something new. Nowadays I see on social media sometimes when people say, I was today years old when I found this out or that out. Man, I like being today years old and finding out new things. So again, for both men and women, all of us, there's some things we can learn from each other. And again, that's one of the goals of this podcast. And finally, permission to be unique. And if you look at the cover art for the podcast, of course I had to play on my name a little bit. I thank God for my name. man, I have learned that my name is one of the greatest gifts that has been given to me. And we'll talk about this another time, but in spite of my history with my mother and the fact that, even today we do not have a relationship, but I am so grateful that she brought me into this world and that she named me. I'm grateful. I'm so eternally grateful. I thank God for naming me unique. And so give yourselves permission to walk in the power that you hold and have and has so graciously been bestowed upon you, that is in you. Permission to be real, authentically you, emotional, permission to feel, permission to be transparent and vulnerable, open to sharing, and open to receiving by being teachable. I want us to embrace our uniqueness, whether that's your physical appearance, what you bring to the table, your talents, your gifts, your knowledge, your wisdom, your understanding, the way that you understand the world around you, all that you have to offer this world. That is what makes you unique. Learning that my being unique is more than just my name has been a joy of a journey. And I want you all to find joy in this journey as well. And the journey of this podcast, the journey that this podcast is going to take us on, I am so excited, so humbled, just so grateful for this opportunity and all that it will bring for all of us. My prayer is that it will be effective, that we will have effective conversations. Yes, effective. And so, again, I thank you for joining me on this first episode, or for this first episode. I hope and pray that this has impacted you in some way, shape, or form, and that you will continue on this journey with me, that you, again, will find encouragement, enlightenment, empowerment, and that this will affect you and cause you to be effective. I should have said, now I'm going to wait all this time to mess up my grammar. But if I was supposed to say affected so that you can be effective, you know what I mean. But I love you. I thank you for listening. And meet me here next week for another episode of Permission to Be Pretty. Take this with you this week. Ponder. Let it marinate. Meditate on it. Start having your own discussions. All right. Until next time, be blessed.